So I want to talk to you about happiness because happiness is what we all want. We want to be happy, we want to be joyous, we want to be free from suffering. So how do we go about getting it? And most importantly, how do we go about getting that happiness that isn't knocked around by external circumstances? So when we talk about happiness, we're talking about the ability to generate pleasant sensations um, in ourselves without them being dependent upon external circumstances. So this is really, really important that we can do this, because when we can do this, then even if the external circumstances are difficult, and even though we might occasionally experience negative emotion, we know how to activate the levers, how to activate the triggers that are going to get us back to happiness, because that's what we all want. So how do we go about doing this? First of all, is that recognition that happiness is an internal state. It's not dependent upon external circumstances. So Dan Gilbert, in his great talk about happiness, says, who's happier after 3 months, the lottery winner or the paraplegic? And the reality is they're both back to the levels of happiness that they were prior to those events. So happiness is not about external circumstances. Happiness is about what we're doing internally, how we're being internally, what we're doing to generate states that take us towards the happiness that we want. So the first thing that we need to understand is, well, where is it coming from? How do we trigger it? What needs to be happening in our lives that enables us, in and of ourselves, independent of external circumstances, to be happy? So what this means is we need to get quite familiar with states that make us happy. So, for instance, peace and serenity. They bring a certain joy and happiness to us, and they're free. And so how do we go about creating serenity and peace in our lives? So for most of us, we need to give ourselves permission. We need to say, actually, my happiness is not coming from outside, because when we think it's coming from outside, we spend all our energy trying to get the external conditions right, and we don't actually spend enough of the time getting our internal conditions right. So recognizing that serenity and peace brings us happiness means that we start to prioritize creating serenity and peace in our lives, so that we're in the habit of creating those states that bring us happiness, rather than being in the habit of creating those states that bring us suffering, i.e. where we're running around like headless chickens trying to create the conditions of happiness outside of ourselves. So happiness, we're starting to notice what brings us serenity, what brings us peace, what makes us open. We're starting to notice ways of thinking and being in the world that bring us love, because love is one of the most potent forms of happiness. If we can learn how to create a loving state, then we can be in perpetual happiness, whatever's going on externally. And that doesn't mean to say that we don't respond to external conditions. We do. And then what we do is that we know that our happiness isn't dependent on other people or other situations, and then we self-generate that happiness again. So we'll talk more about how to create happiness, but I hope this has given you a little bit of a flavour for why happiness is important, and some of the things that we can do that help us to be happier in the future.